One man, one gun built for 6, 400 enemies closing in through the fog, and a decision so insane it should have ended in seconds, but instead changed the course of a war nobody was supposed to know about. July 19th, 1972. The name Mirbat means nothing to most people, but to the men who were there, to the rebels who survived it, to the governments that buried the truth for 40 years, this tiny fishing town in Oman became the site of something the history books still cannot fully explain. 9 British SAS operators, outnumbered 40 to 1, surrounded by Soviet-trained guerrillas armed with heavy weapons, mortars, and the absolute certainty of victory. The fog was so thick you could barely see 10 meters ahead. The assault was perfectly planned. Every tactical advantage belonged to the enemy. By every rational calculation, those 9 men should have been wiped out before breakfast. But then a Fijian giant named Talaiasi Labalaba did something that military analysts still argue was either the most brilliant tactical decision in modern warfare or pure suicidal madness. He ran 800 yards through enemy fire, alone, toward a massive artillery piece that required 6 trained men to operate. And what he did next with that gun, while his body was being torn apart by bullets, has become the darkest, most classified legend in Special Forces history. The governments tried to bury this story. They gave him the lowest possible medal. They classified the details for 4 decades. They hoped nobody would ever know what really happened on that hill. But the truth always finds a way out, and what you are about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about human limits, about courage, about the price of holding the line when the world is collapsing around you. Stay with me until the end, because the final moments of this battle are something no Hollywood script would dare to write. This is the story they never wanted you to know. The morning of July 19th, 1972 began like the mouth of hell, opening without warning. Dawn in Mirbat was supposed to be quiet, a fishing town on the edge of Oman's Dhofar province, where the desert meets the Arabian Sea, where British Special Air Service operators ran medical clinics and trained local militiamen in tactics that would never be taught in London. 9 men, just 9 operators from B Squadron. Their mission was to hold this dusty outpost, keep the communist tide from swallowing the Sultan's fragile grip on the south, and maybe, if they were lucky, survive another rotation without the rebels noticing how thin the line really was. But what those 9 men did not know was that 300 to 400 Adu guerrillas had been crawling toward their position for hours. Under cover of monsoon fog so thick you could barely see your hand in front of your face, the rebels moved with disciplined silence. Soviet-trained, Chinese-advised, armed with AK-47s, heavy mortars, and 75mm recoilless rifles capable of punching through stone walls like they were cardboard. The Adu had been planning this assault for weeks, studying the patterns of the SAS team, waiting for the perfect conditions, and now the fog gave them the invisibility they needed to get close enough to guarantee annihilation. The SAS position consisted of a small compound near the center of town, a secondary fort called the Gendarmerie just to the north, and an old gun emplacement on a hill overlooking the harbor. That gun emplacement held a relic from a previous war, a 25-pounder artillery piece, a beast of a weapon designed to be operated by 6 trained men working in synchronized rhythm. It sat there like a museum piece, greased and maintained, but rarely fired. a symbol more than a tool. Nobody expected it would become the only thing standing between survival and complete massacre. Inside the main compound, the 9 SAS men were asleep or just stirring when the first mortar rounds began to scream overhead. The explosions tore through the pre-dawn silence like a chainsaw through silk. Walls cracked, dust erupted. The SAS operators rolled from their cots, grabbed weapons, and sprinted to firing positions with the muscle memory of men who had done this 1,000 times in 1,000 other hellholes. But within seconds, they realized this was not a probing attack. This was not harassment fire. This was an extinction-level assault designed to overrun the compound before reinforcements could arrive, before the sun could burn off the fog, before anyone even knew they were dying. The radio crackled with desperate calls for air support, but the nearest jets were at Salalah Air Base, 20 minutes away if they scrambled immediately. 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. The Adu were already at the wire, cutting through defenses, pouring fire into the compound from 3 directions at once. Every second brought them closer to breaching the perimeter and turning the fight into a slaughter. But standing in that compound was a man who would refuse to let that happen. Sergeant Talaiasi Labalaba was not your typical SAS operator, though nothing about the regiment was typical to begin with. Born in Fiji, he stood 6 feet tall and weighed close to 220 pounds, a physical giant among men who prided themselves on endurance over bulk. He had joined the British Army as a paratrooper, passed SAS selection with scores that made the instructors nervous, and deployed to Oman as part of the quiet war that nobody back in England was supposed to know about. His call sign was simple. His reputation was anything but. The Fijians who served alongside him spoke of a man who could carry a wounded soldier on his back for miles without breaking stride, who could strip and reassemble a weapon blindfolded, who never showed fear, even when fear was the only rational response. That morning, as the Adu closed in under the fog, Labalaba realized something that turned his blood cold. The light machine guns positioned around the compound were not going to be enough. The rebels were advancing in waves, using the fog as cover, firing disciplined bursts to keep the SAS pinned while the main force maneuvered closer. Within minutes, they would breach the wire. Within an hour, every man in that compound would be torn apart. The math was brutal and simple. 9 against 400 meant certain death unless something changed the equation dramatically. Labalaba made a decision that defied every tactical manual ever written. He grabbed his rifle, slung ammunition belts across his chest, and sprinted out of the compound into the open ground between the buildings and the gun emplacement on the hill. 800 yards. That is roughly half a mile of exposed terrain with no cover, no concealment, nothing but dirt, and the hope that the Adu gunners could not see through the fog well enough to track a running man. Bullets cracked past his head. Mortar fragments hissed through the air. He did not slow down. He did not zigzag. He ran in a straight line because every second counted and deviation meant delay. What he was running toward would have made most men turn back. When he reached the gun emplacement, he found it empty except for the 25-pounder sitting silent and cold. A 25-pounder artillery piece is not a rifle. It is not something you point and shoot. It is a crew-served weapon requiring at minimum 6 trained men to operate effectively. 1 to load the shell, 1 to set the fuse, 1 to adjust elevation, 1 to traverse the barrel, one to fire and one to coordinate the chaos. The ammunition is heavy, each shell weighing 25 pounds, hence the name. The recoil is brutal. The heat buildup after sustained fire can warp the barrel if you are not careful. It was designed for indirect fire, lobbing high explosive rounds over hills and into enemy formations miles away, not for direct confrontation at point-blank range. Labalaba looked at the gun, looked at the advancing Adu, did the math in his head and realized he had no choice. He began to operate the weapon alone, doing the work of 6 men with nothing but raw strength and absolute refusal to accept failure. First, he loaded a shell into the breech, a task that normally required 2 men because of the weight and the precision needed to seat it correctly. His muscles screamed as he lifted the 25-pound projectile and slammed it home. Then he adjusted the elevation, cranking the wheel by hand, angling the barrel down because the enemy was not over the horizon. They were right there, barely 300 meters away and closing fast through the fog. Then he sighted the target, a task made nearly impossible by the limited visibility and the fact that the gun had no modern optics, just iron sights designed for a different kind of war. Then he yanked the firing lanyard. The 25-pounder roared like a demon unleashed. The explosion of the shell leaving the barrel was deafening, a concussive blast that hammered the air and sent a shockwave rippling outward. The shell screamed downrange and detonated in the middle of an advancing Adu column, shredding bodies and scattering the survivors like leaves in a hurricane. Labalaba did not wait to admire his work. He was already loading the next round, his hands moving with mechanical precision, sweat pouring down his face, muscles burning from the repetitive strain of lifting shells that weighed as much as a small child. The Adu realized what was happening and redirected their fire toward the gun emplacement. Bullets began to snap against the sandbags with increasing frequency. Mortar rounds walked closer, each explosion sending geysers of dirt and stone into the air, the rebels adjusting their aim with every salvo. Labalaba ignored them. He fired again and again. Each shot was a precision strike, delivered with a weapon never meant for this kind of engagement, each shell ripping into the rebel formations and forcing them to scatter, to take cover, to slow their advance just enough to buy a few more minutes. The barrel began to glow from the heat. His hands blistered from handling hot metal. Still he loaded and fired. But the enemy was learning, adapting, bringing heavier weapons to bear on the lone gunner who dared to challenge an entire army. The Adu were not amateurs. They had been trained by Soviet advisors who understood tactics, who understood that a lone gunner, no matter how skilled, could be suppressed and eliminated. They brought up their recoilless rifles, massive anti-tank weapons that could punch through concrete, and began to zero in on the hill. The first shot missed by meters. The second hit closer. The third was dialed in perfectly. A shell hit the sandbags to Labalaba's left, exploding with a flash of white-hot shrapnel that tore through the protective barrier like tissue paper. Fragments ripped through his shoulder, slicing through flesh and muscle, blood spraying across the breech of the gun in arterial spurts. He staggered, but did not fall. He grabbed another shell, his wounded arm screaming in protest, loaded it with movements that were becoming slower and less coordinated, fired. The recoil slammed the gun backward, and he braced against it, ignoring the pain, ignoring the wetness spreading down his arm and soaking into his shirt, ignoring the fact that his body was beginning to shut down from blood loss and shock. The radio in the main compound crackled with increasingly desperate reports, painting a picture of total chaos. The SAS team was holding their position, but barely, expending ammunition at an unsustainable rate. The Adu had breached the outer perimeter of the gendarmerie fort and were fighting room to room against the local militiamen. Some of the Omani fighters were breaking under the pressure, fleeing into the town, others dying in place as they tried to hold corridors and doorways against overwhelming numbers. The only thing keeping the entire defensive line from collapsing completely was the artillery fire from the hill, the impossible one-man barrage that kept the main Adu force pinned down and unable to concentrate their assault on a single point. Labalaba fired again and again. His movements were slowing now, each action taking longer than the last. The adrenaline was no longer enough to mask the damage his body had sustained. Blood pooled at his feet, soaking into the dirt, turning the ground beneath the gun into slick mud. His vision blurred at the edges. His hands shook. But he kept loading, kept firing, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant the end of everyone in that town. The shells kept screaming downrange. The Adu kept dying, the line held by the thinnest of margins. Then a bullet hit him in the jaw, and the world exploded into white-hot agony. The impact shattered bone, tore through tissue, sent fragments of teeth spraying into the back of his throat. He collapsed against the gun, choking on his own blood, the world spinning, pain like a white-hot wire threaded through his skull and down his spine. For a moment, he could not see, could not hear anything except a high-pitched ringing, could not think beyond the animal panic of a body realizing it was catastrophically broken. His knees buckled, his hands slipped from the gun. He slid down toward the ground. But then something deeper than conscious thought took over, something primal and unbreakable. The fog cleared in his mind just enough for one coherent thought. The gun. He pushed himself upright, spitting blood and fragments of bone, his jaw hanging at an unnatural angle that made breathing a struggle. He could not speak, could not scream even if he wanted to, but he could still move his arms, could still drag another shell from the ammunition pile with movements that were more instinct than coordination, could still load and fire even as his body was falling apart around him. The Adu gunners saw the artillery piece fire again and could not believe what they were witnessing. They had seen the hit. They had watched the operator go down, seen the spray of blood, heard the impact. How was the gun still firing? Some of the rebels began to hesitate, their advance faltering as superstitious fear crept in. This was not natural. This was not possible. They were shooting at a ghost, a demon, something that refused to die no matter how many bullets found their mark. Labalaba fired 3 more times with his jaw destroyed, operating purely on muscle memory and rage that transcended pain. Each shot was a final act of defiance against an enemy that should have already won, that had done everything right tactically, that deserved victory by every conventional measure. The shells kept landing among the Adu formations, breaking up their cohesion, forcing them to retreat back into the fog, buying just a few more precious minutes. His hands were moving on autopilot now. Load, aim, fire, load, aim, fire. The rhythm was all that mattered. The rhythm was keeping everyone alive. Back in the main compound, another SAS operator named Corporal Tommy Tobin realized Labalaba was alone on the hill and made a decision that was either incredibly brave or completely insane. He would run the same 800 yards under fire to reinforce the gun position. Tobin sprinted through the chaos, bullets kicking up dirt at his heels, mortar rounds bracketing his path, the fog thinning just enough to make him visible to every Adu fighter with a clear line of sight. He ran like a man possessed, covering ground in great bounding strides, and reached the gun emplacement to find Labalaba slumped against the breach, his face a mask of blood, his jaw shattered, still trying to load another shell with hands that could barely grip. Tobin took over loading while Labalaba aimed and fired, the two of them working in grim silence because there was nothing to say. There were no words for what they were doing, no speeches about duty or honor, just the mechanical rhythm of loading and firing. Two men operating a six-man weapon in the middle of an apocalypse. Together, they kept the gun operational, kept the rounds screaming downrange, kept the Adu at bay, even as the situation spiraled further into nightmare territory. The barrel was glowing red now. The recoil was becoming erratic. The ammunition pile was dwindling, but the jets were finally inbound, their engines screaming through the monsoon clouds. Two Strikemaster ground attack aircraft dove out of the grey sky like avenging angels, their pilots having pushed their machines to the absolute limit to cut the response time. They began strafing runs on the Adu positions, their 20mm cannons tearing through the rebel formations with devastating effect. Explosions rippled across the battlefield. Bodies flew through the air. The tide was beginning to turn. Then a mortar round landed directly in the gun emplacement, and everything went to hell. The explosion was catastrophic, a direct hit that detonated with enough force to throw both men like rag dolls. Shrapnel ripped through flesh and bone. Tobin was thrown backward, critically wounded but miraculously alive, his body riddled with fragments, but his vital organs somehow spared. Labalaba took the brunt of the blast, his torso shredded by shrapnel, his chest torn open, his lungs filling with blood. He fell to the ground and did not get up. Could not get up. His body had finally reached the limit of what damage it could absorb and still function. But he had done enough, bought enough time, killed enough enemy fighters to shift the balance. The delay he created allowed the jets to arrive before the compound fell. His impossible stand at the gun gave the helicopters time to reach Mirbat with reinforcements from G Squadron, fresh operators who fast roped into the compound with weapons hot and immediately began turning the defensive battle into an offensive slaughter. The Adu, realizing they had lost the element of surprise and were now facing coordinated air support and reinforced ground troops, began to retreat. They dragged their dead and wounded back into the mountains, leaving behind a battlefield littered with shell casings, blood, and the smouldering wreckage of what should have been an easy victory. When the medics reached the gun emplacement, they found Labalaba still breathing, barely, each breath a wet gurgle. His body was broken beyond any possibility of repair. Multiple gunshot wounds, shrapnel wounds covering his torso, his jaw shattered, his lungs punctured, blood everywhere. They tried to stabilize him, tried to stem the bleeding with pressure bandages and emergency transfusions. But there was too much damage, too many wounds, too much blood already soaked into the dirt beneath him. He died there, on the hill, next to the gun he had operated alone against an army, his hands still stained with powder residue and his own blood, his eyes still open and staring at the sky. The official records would later state that Sergeant Talaiasi Labalaba was killed in action during the defense of Mirbat on July 19th, 1972. He was awarded a mention in dispatches, a low-level commendation that felt like a slap in the face to the men who had fought beside him. Many in the regiment believed he deserved the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honour, the medal reserved for acts of valour so extreme they bordered on the superhuman. But the operation was classified, the details buried under layers of secrecy, and the public would not learn the full story for decades. The politicians and bureaucrats decided that acknowledging what happened at Mirbat would raise uncomfortable questions about British involvement in Oman, about covert operations in the Middle East, about how deep the SAS was really operating in regions the government claimed were stable. But among the SAS, the story of Labalaba became something more than legend. It became doctrine. It was not just the fact that he operated a six-man weapon alone under sustained fire. It was not just the fact that he continued fighting with catastrophic injuries that should have killed him within minutes. It was the sheer audacity of the decision to sprint 800 yards into an active kill zone because he understood, in that split second of calculation, that the conventional response was not going to be enough. Every tactic in the manual said to consolidate defenses, maintain firing positions, wait for air support. Labalaba looked at those tactics and decided they were a recipe for annihilation. The Battle of Mirbat was a turning point in the Dhofar rebellion that would echo for years. The Adu never again attempted an assault of that scale or ambition. The myth of the invincible guerrilla fighter honed in the jungles of Vietnam and the mountains of Afghanistan shattered against the walls of a small fishing town defended by 9 men who refused to follow the script. The Sultan's forces, bolstered by SAS training and tactics, began to gain the upper hand across the province. Within a few years, the rebellion was crushed, and Oman stabilized into the relatively peaceful state it remains today. But that stability was built on the bodies of men like Labalaba, who held the line when retreat was the rational choice. His body was flown back to Britain and buried quietly, attended by his family and a few regimental comrades who could not speak about what he had done. The mission was still classified. The details were still secret. At the funeral, nobody could explain why this Fijian giant had died in Oman, what he had been doing there, what he had accomplished. The newspapers did not cover it. The television did not mention it. He was buried with military honors but without glory, another name in the long list of soldiers who died in places the public was not supposed to know about. It would take nearly 40 years for the full details of the Battle of Mirbat to be declassified and published in books and documentaries. By then, many of the men who had fought there were gone or retired, their stories locked away in the memories of a generation that had been told to stay silent. When the story finally emerged, it sparked outrage among military historians and veterans groups who argued that Labalaba had been denied the recognition he deserved. Campaigns were launched to posthumously award him the Victoria Cross. Petitions were signed. Letters were written to Parliament. Documentaries were made featuring interviews with surviving SAS operators who described in detail what they had witnessed on that hill. But the British government held firm, citing the original decision to award a mention in dispatches and refusing to reopen the case. The official explanation was that the classified nature of the operation at the time precluded higher recognition, and that changing the award decades later would set a problematic precedent. The real reason whispered among those who understood military politics, was simpler and uglier. Acknowledging the full scale of Labalaba's heroism would require acknowledging the full scale of the SAS's involvement in Oman, which would open uncomfortable questions about British foreign policy, covert operations, and the lies told to Parliament about what British soldiers were really doing in the Middle East. So the legend remained unofficial, a story told in bars and barracks, and passed down from veteran to recruit. It grew slightly more mythic with each retelling, but never strayed far from the truth, because the truth was already unbelievable. American Special Forces operators who deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan decades later heard the story and were stunned. The idea of a single man operating a crew-served artillery piece in direct fire combat with a shattered jaw, bleeding out, and refusing to stop until he physically could not continue, sounded like propaganda. But the operators who had been there, who had seen the shell casings piled around the gun, who had counted the Adu bodies scattered in front of the emplacement, confirmed every detail. The Russians heard the story too, though it took years for the full account to reach Moscow. Soviet advisors who had trained the Adu forces could not explain how an assault with overwhelming numerical superiority, supported by heavy weapons and executed under perfect cover conditions, had been stopped cold by 9 men. The failure at Mirbat became a case study in Soviet military academies, a lesson in what happens when tactical planning meets an enemy that refuses to follow the expected pattern of behavior. The conclusion was uncomfortable. No amount of training or equipment could guarantee victory against soldiers willing to make decisions that bordered on suicidal. But perhaps the most important audience for the story was the next generation of SAS operators who came after. Labalaba's actions became the standard against which every selection candidate was measured, though not in the way most people would expect. It was not about the physical feats, though those were extraordinary. It was not about the marksmanship, though that was flawless. It was about the willingness to make the insane decision when the sane decision would lead to failure. The ability to look at an impossible situation and say, "I can fix this," even when fixing it means running into gunfire. Even when fixing it means operating a weapon that should require 6 men. Even when fixing it means accepting that you are probably going to die in the next few minutes. That mindset, that refusal to accept defeat even in the face of mathematical certainty, became the core of SAS selection and training. Candidates were pushed beyond exhaustion, beyond reason, beyond the point where quitting seemed like the only logical response. They were placed in scenarios designed to be unwinnable, given tasks that seemed impossible, and then watched to see who would find a way anyway. Those who passed were the ones who kept moving when their bodies and minds screamed at them to stop. Those who failed were sent back to their units with the understanding that the regiment required something more than skill or strength. It required a kind of controlled madness, a willingness to embrace the void and fight anyway. The weapon itself, the 25-pounder artillery piece, became an object of intense study and fascination. Military historians analyzed the mechanics of how a single operator could fire it effectively under combat conditions. Engineers calculated the physical stress involved in loading, aiming, and firing shells that weighed 25 pounds each in rapid succession, while wounded and under sustained enemy fire. The consensus was that it should not have been possible. The strain on the lower back alone should have incapacitated Labalaba after the first few rounds. The heat build-up in the barrel should have caused a malfunction or warped the firing mechanism. The recoil should have thrown him off balance, especially after he was wounded and his coordination was compromised. But the gun fired more than 30 times in less than 2 hours, all while operated by a single man. Some speculated that adrenaline explained it, the body's natural painkiller and performance enhancer kicking in during life-or-death situations and allowing feats of strength that would be impossible under normal conditions. Others pointed to Labalaba's exceptional physical conditioning, the result of years of brutal training and genetic advantages that made him stronger and more resilient than the average soldier. But the operators who knew him offered a simpler explanation that cut through all the scientific analysis. He decided it was going to work, and his body obeyed. There is a concept in military psychology called the will to fight, a metric that attempts to quantify why some units hold under impossible odds. Researchers have identified factors like training quality, leadership competence, unit cohesion, and ideological commitment as contributors to combat effectiveness. But none of those factors fully explain moments like Mirbat, 9 men against 400. No reinforcements for 20 minutes, no air support until the assault was already well underway. Every rational calculation said they should have been overrun within the first hour. Every tactical model predicted complete annihilation. But they were not annihilated, and the reason was not superior firepower or better positions. Labalaba's stand at the gun was the tipping point that shifted the entire dynamic of the battle. His decision to sprint to that emplacement, to operate it alone, to keep firing even after being hit multiple times, created a psychological effect on the battlefield that weapons and tactics alone could not achieve. The Adu forces, despite their numerical advantage and superior positioning, began to hesitate. They had been told this would be a quick victory, a slaughter of a small, isolated garrison that would demonstrate the power of the rebellion. But the artillery fire from the hill was relentless, accurate, devastating. It shattered their confidence, broke their momentum, turned what should have been a triumphant charge into a grinding, bloody stalemate. The fog that had given the Adu their initial advantage became their prison as the battle dragged on. They could not see the full extent of the SAS defenses, or lack thereof. They could not coordinate their movements effectively when visibility was measured in meters. All they knew was that shells were landing among them with terrifying precision, that their comrades were dying in groups, and that the town they were supposed to capture was still in enemy hands hours after the assault began. The confusion and fear spread through their ranks like a virus. When the jets finally arrived, screaming out of the monsoon clouds with cannons blazing, the Adu realized they had walked into a meat grinder. The retreat was chaotic and brutal, a scrambling dash back into the mountains with SAS snipers picking off stragglers and helicopter gunships harassing the flanks. Bodies were left behind because there was no time to retrieve them. Wounded men were abandoned because carrying them would slow the retreat. By the time the sun fully rose and the fog burned off completely, the battlefield was a graveyard littered with spent casings, discarded equipment, and the broken bodies of rebels who had believed victory was assured. The SAS suffered 2 operators killed and 2 wounded, numbers that seemed impossible given the odds they had faced. The Adu suffered over 100 confirmed fatalities and an unknown number of wounded who were dragged away during the retreat or who crawled off to die in the mountains. The strategic impact rippled far beyond the immediate tactical victory. The rebellion never recovered its momentum after Mirbat. The myth of the invincible guerrilla fighter The image of unstoppable revolutionaries that had been built up through successes in Vietnam and Algeria, shattered against the reality of 9 men who simply refused to die. But for Labalaba, there would be no recognition beyond the whispers of the men who served with him. No medal ceremony in London, no mention in the newspapers, no statue in Whitehall. His family was told he died serving his country, but not how, not where, not why. The details remained locked in classified files for decades, accessible only to those with the highest security clearances. Even his fellow operators could not speak openly about what had happened, bound by Official Secrets Act restrictions that carried severe penalties for violation. It would take nearly 4 decades for the truth to emerge, and when it did, the reaction was explosive. The full details of the Battle of Mirbat were finally declassified and published in books and documentaries in the early 2000s, sparking immediate outrage among veterans groups and military historians. How could a man who single-handedly operated a crew-served artillery piece while catastrophically wounded, who held off an army, who died buying time for his teammates, receive only a mention in dispatches, the lowest level of official recognition? The campaigns for posthumous upgrade to the Victoria Cross were loud and sustained, supported by testimony from surviving SAS operators who provided detailed accounts of what they had witnessed. But the British government refused to budge, citing procedural reasons and the passage of time. The official line was that awards could not be retroactively upgraded without setting dangerous precedents. The unofficial truth, known to anyone who understood how military politics worked, was that fully acknowledging Labalaba's sacrifice would require fully acknowledging the scope of SAS operations in Oman. That would mean admitting that Parliament had been misled about British involvement in the Dhofar conflict, that special forces had been engaged in sustained combat operations, while the government claimed only advisory roles were being filled. So the legend remained in the shadows, growing stronger precisely because it was unofficial. Modern special forces units around the world study the Battle of Mirbat as a masterclass in small unit tactics and the decisive importance of individual initiative in combat. The lesson is brutally clear. Technology and numbers matter, but they are not determinative. What determines outcomes in desperate situations is the willingness of individual operators to make the hard call, to take the insane risk, to hold the line when every rational voice screams retreat. American Special Operations Forces who deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s and beyond carried the story of Mirbat with them like a talisman. Delta Force operators incorporated elements of the battle into their training scenarios. Navy SEALs used it as an example in their leadership courses. Even the Australians, who prided themselves on their own unconventional approach to warfare, acknowledged that Mirbat set a standard that few could match. The story transcended national boundaries and service rivalries to become part of the shared mythology of special operations forces worldwide. The gun emplacement on the hill overlooking Mirbat Harbour remains a pilgrimage site for those who know its significance. SAS veterans visit in small groups, often without announcing their presence, standing silently in front of the memorial plaque that marks where Labalaba made his stand. They look out over the town and the water, imagining what it must have been like to be alone on that hill with a weapon that should not have worked, facing an enemy that should have won, and choosing to fight anyway. The 25-pounder is still there, though it is no longer operational. Rust has claimed the barrel. The breech mechanism is locked open and corroded, but it stands as a monument not just to one man's extraordinary courage, but to a philosophy of warfare that refuses to accept defeat. That philosophy is simple: find a way or make one. When the odds are mathematically impossible, when the textbook says retreat, when every rational calculation points to failure, there is still a choice. You can accept the inevitable, or you can run to the gun. You can follow the safe playbook, or you can do something so audacious that the enemy cannot comprehend it. You can preserve your life by abandoning your mission, or you can spend your life buying time for others to survive. Labalaba chose the gun, and in doing so, he created a standard that haunts and inspires every special operations soldier who comes after. His legacy is not a medal or a monument, though he deserved both. His legacy is a question posed to every operator in every desperate situation. When your moment comes, when the fog lifts and you see the overwhelming force bearing down on your position, when you have 800 yards of open ground between you and the only weapon that might change the outcome, will you run toward the fire or away from it? That question has no comfortable answer, which is precisely why it matters. The men who pass SAS selection are the ones who, when confronted with that question in training, in simulation, in the exhausted delirium of the final phase, instinctively choose the gun. They are the ones who look at the impossible task and immediately start calculating how to make it work, rather than why it cannot. They are the ones who, like Labalaba, possess that indefinable quality that turns ordinary soldiers into legends through sheer force of will and refusal to quit. The Battle of Mirbat ended in the morning light of July 19th, 1972, but its echoes continue. Every time an outnumbered Special Forces team holds a position against overwhelming odds, Labalaba's ghost is there. Every time an operator makes the decision to do something tactically insane because the safe option guarantees failure, his example provides validation. Every time a young soldier in selection is pushed beyond the breaking point and finds a way to continue, he is walking in footsteps laid down on a hill in Oman 50 years ago. The Adu fighters who survived the battle and eventually laid down their weapons as the rebellion collapsed carried their own memories of that morning. In the years that followed, some spoke quietly about the terror of facing artillery fire that never stopped, that seemed to come from nowhere, that killed with mechanical precision even as they poured fire back at its source. They spoke of the moment when they realized the compound would not fall, when the jets arrived and turned the tide completely, when retreat became the only option. Some admitted they had nightmares about the lone gun on the hill that refused to go silent, but most of all, they remembered that the myth of their invincibility died at Mirbat. The rebellion had momentum before that morning. It had support from powerful foreign backers. It had weapons, training, and the belief that victory was inevitable. After Mirbat, all of that evaporated. The survivors spread word of what had happened, and that word poisoned morale across the insurgency. If a force of 400 trained fighters with heavy weapons and perfect conditions could not overrun 9 men, what chance did the rebellion have against the full weight of British-trained Sultan's forces? The answer, as events proved, was none. Within 3 years, the Dhofar rebellion was effectively over. The Sultan's forces, using tactics learned from the SAS, systematically isolated and defeated the remaining Adu groups. The foreign advisors withdrew. The supply lines dried up. The dream of a communist revolution in Oman died not with a bang, but with a whimper. starved of the momentum that Mirbat had stolen. And through it all, the gun on the hill stood silent, its work done, its operator gone. Talaiasi Labalaba was 31 years old when he died. He left behind a wife and children who would grow up hearing only fragments of what their husband and father had accomplished. The full story would not reach them for decades, and when it did, it came with the bitter knowledge that his sacrifice had been deliberately minimized by a government that valued secrecy over recognition. But in the places that matter, among the men who do the actual fighting, Labalaba's name carries weight that no official medal could provide. Mention his name in an SAS bar, and the conversation stops. The old veterans will nod, will raise a glass, will remember. The younger operators will listen to the story again, even though they have heard it a dozen times, because each telling reinforces the standard they are expected to meet, not in peacetime, not in training, but in that moment when everything goes wrong, when the plan collapses, when death is certain unless someone does something extraordinary. That is when Labalaba's ghost appears, asking the eternal question, will you run to the gun? The answer determines everything.